The steak's aroma carried shame across the Texas air. Karl Brenner stared at the plate, knife trembling. Behind barbed wire, German prisoners ate better than generals in Berlin. His sister's last letter weighed in his pocket. "We boiled potato peels twice now." Blood rushed to his face as he cut into the tender meat, American abundance mocking his family's hunger. The guards called it Sunday dinner. Karl called it betrayal of everything he once believed about who was winning this war. Subscribe to uncover how the most painful defeats happen, not on battlefields, but at dinner tables where enemies feed you better than your fatherland. The bell echoed across the dusty Texas compound, stirring Karl Brenner from his bunk where he'd been rereading the letter. His sister Greta's handwriting had grown smaller since the war began, as if she were trying to conserve paper along with everything else in Berlin. She wrote about their mother's persistent cough, about the neighbor's disappearance one night, about standing in ration lines for 6 hours only to receive a loaf so hard it required soaking before eating. She never complained outright. The censors would have blacked it out. But the desperation lived between the lines, in the pressure of her pencil, when she described how they'd begun to scrape mold from bread crusts rather than discard anything edible. Karl folded the letter carefully, tucking it beneath his mattress alongside the others. 3 months since his capture in France, 2 months in this Texas camp, and the contrast grew more unbearable with each passing day. The Germans had been told horror stories about American captivity, warnings of starvation, abuse, forced labor until collapse. Karl had prepared himself mentally for suffering, had accepted it as the soldier's fate. When the transport planes landed in America, he and his fellow Wehrmacht soldiers had tightened their expressions, bracing for whatever cruelty awaited them. They'd marched from the airfield with rigid dignity, determined to reveal no weakness to their captors. Instead, they'd been driven through endless green fields to this camp outside San Antonio, where wire fences couldn't conceal the surrounding abundance. The first meal had stunned them into silence. Real bread, not the sawdust-supplemented loaves they'd grown accustomed to in the field. Coffee with actual sugar. Portions large enough to fill a man's stomach completely. Karl had eaten mechanically, certain it was some kind of psychological trick, a display meant to be withdrawn once they'd lowered their guard. He'd warned the others in his barracks. "Don't get used to this. It's American propaganda. Tomorrow we'll see what they really intend for us." But tomorrow had brought another full meal, and the day after that, and the weeks since. Karl had watched disbelief transform into cautious gratitude among the prisoners, had seen hollow cheeks filling out, uniforms growing snug where they'd hung loose before. They were fed better here, as captives of the enemy, than they had been as soldiers of the Reich. Nobody discussed this contradiction aloud, but Karl caught the troubled glances exchanged over mess hall tables, the way some men ate ravenously while others hesitated, as if ashamed to accept such bounty when letters from home spoke of potato peel soup and bread crusts, shared among entire families. Sunday brought special meals. This, they'd quickly learned. American tradition, the guards explained, without irony or apparent awareness of how this kindness cut deeper than any cruelty could have. The smell now filling the compound was unmistakable. Beef. Karl's mouth watered involuntarily as he joined the others filing toward the mess hall, military habits keeping their lines straight despite their prisoner status. Behind him, someone whispered, "Meine Mutter hat seit 1942 kein Fleisch mehr gegessen." My mother hasn't eaten meat since 1942. Karl pretended not to hear, but the words burrowed into him, cold and sharp as shrapnel, embedding somewhere he couldn't reach to extract them. The steak glistened on Karl's plate, a pool of reddish juice spreading toward the mashed potatoes and green beans. Around him, the mess hall hummed with the strange, muted atmosphere that had developed among the prisoners. Not quite celebration, not quite mourning, but something uniquely their own. Some men ate with methodical precision, cutting meat into identical squares as if maintaining this discipline might preserve something essential about themselves. Others ate slowly, eyes closed, savoring each bite with an intensity that bordered on religious. A few always ate quickly, hunched protective shoulders around their plates, old habits from the Eastern Front where food could freeze before you finished if you weren't fast enough. Carl cut a piece and held it on his fork, watching steam rise from the pink center. His father had been a butcher before the war, before rationing had reduced his shop to distributing government-approved portions so meager they barely required his professional skills to prepare. Carl remembered watching him before the war, the confident movements of his hands as he transformed carcasses into cuts that would feed families across their Berlin neighborhood. He remembered the pride in his father's voice. In Deutschland, selbst der ärmste Arbeiter ist wie ein König am Sonntag. In Germany, even the poorest worker eats like a king on Sunday. The memory tasted like ash as Carl put the steak in his mouth. Across the table, Werner Kessler was writing calculations again on a napkin, something he'd done obsessively since arriving at the camp. A mathematics professor before the war, Werner had channeled his anxiety into computations, counting calories, estimating agricultural yields, calculating the differential between American and German food production. Americans produce 4 times the meat per capita that Germany does now, he announced to no one in particular, scratching numbers with a pencil stub. Their agricultural efficiency isn't even at maximum capacity yet. They're feeding us, enemy combatants, better than our high command eats in Berlin, and it costs them nothing. It's simply overflow, excess. The mathematics of this war were inevitable. Carl wanted to tell him to stop, that such talk bordered on treason, but the words died in his throat. They were long past such pretenses here, surrounded by evidence that contradicted everything the Reich had told them about American weakness and German superiority. Dieter, a farmer's son from Bavaria, nodded slowly at Werner's assessment. My father wrote that they're slaughtering breeding stock now. Not just for meat. They can't feed the animals anymore. Short-term gain, long-term disaster. He pushed a piece of steak across his plate, leaving a smear of red. When I think of my brothers pulling that plow themselves because the horses are gone. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was broken by the arrival of mail call, the weekly ritual that connected them to the fading world they'd left behind. Carl didn't stand immediately. Greta's letters always undid something in him, some careful construction of denial he'd built to make his captivity bearable. He watched others move eagerly toward the guards, distributing envelopes, their faces animated with hope. Joseph, the youngest of them at barely 18, received nothing again and returned to his seat with the now familiar vacant expression. Carl had seen that same emptiness in men's eyes moments before they charged enemy lines, a surrender preceding the battle. When his name was called, Carl approached mechanically, accepted the thin envelope with its familiar handwriting. He returned to his seat but didn't open it immediately, letting it rest beside his plate while he continued eating. The meat was perfectly cooked, tender enough to cut with the side of his fork. Carl found himself wondering about the cow it came from. Was it raised nearby, on one of the vast Texas ranches they'd glimpsed during transport? Did it graze freely until the day it was selected for slaughter? Such luxury of space and resources seemed impossible after years of European battlefields, where every centimeter had been fought for, bled for, died for. His knife scraped across the plate with a sound that made his molars ache. Greta's handwriting had grown even smaller, compressed by necessity and perhaps by fear. Carl held the letter close to his face in the fading Texas evening light, squinting to make out the tightly packed words. "Dearest brother," she began, as always, "we received word of your capture and are thanking God daily for your safety." The formality of her phrasing was for the censors, but Carl could read between the lines. Capture meant survival. Whatever happened now, he would not be another telegram, another black-bordered notice delivered to their mother's door. In their neighborhood, such notices arrived almost daily now. Berlin was running out of sons to lose. She wrote of mundane matters first. Mother's garden yielding a few precious vegetables, the neighbor's cat having kittens, trivial things that carved a path of normalcy through abnormal times. Karl recognized the strategy. He'd employed it himself in letters from the front. Only in the third paragraph did she approach reality. Our rations were reduced again last week. Mother insists I take the larger portion, though I argue against it. We've become creative with what remains. Did you know bread crusts can be toasted twice, then ground into a kind of coffee? It's not unpleasant with a bit of imagination. Herr Weber showed us how to make soup from potato peelings and water. The first boiling goes to the adults, the second to the children. There is still nutrition, he insists. We pretend to believe him. Karl lowered the letter, staring across the compound where other prisoners sat similarly engrossed in communications from a homeland growing more distant by the day. He thought of the breakfast he'd eaten that morning, eggs, bacon, toast with butter, casual abundance that would have seemed mythological to Greta. How could he possibly describe his circumstances without it sounding like cruelty? His first letters home had been cautious, vague about conditions, focused on his health and safety rather than details that might pain them. But rumors had a way of traveling, even across war zones. We hear the Americans feed their prisoners well, Greta had written 3 weeks ago. Is it true? No one quite believes it. He resumed reading, chest tightening as her words grew more direct. The bombing continues, though we've grown accustomed to the sound. One learns to distinguish between planes passing over and those circling back. Last Tuesday, they hit the Schmitz building. Elizabeth and her mother had gone for water. Her father and brothers were not so fortunate. At the funeral, just a gathering really, as there were no coffins to be had, Elizabeth stood so still she might have been carved from stone. I put my arm around her, but felt nothing in return, no response, as if she'd departed along with them. Mother says we must invite her for Sunday dinner, though what we'll serve with our rations I cannot imagine. Outside Karl's barracks, the evening shift of American guards was changing over. They were mostly farm boys from the surrounding countryside, sunburned young men who regarded their German prisoners with curiosity rather than hatred. Many were the same age as Karl, some even younger. They called cheerful greetings to each other, tossed jokes back and forth, displayed none of the rigid formality that would have been demanded of German guards. Occasionally, they even exchanged awkward pleasantries with the prisoners in mangled attempts at German, or through the few prisoners who spoke English. Their ease was just another luxury in this place of abundant food and open spaces, another reminder of the disparity between their worlds. Greta's letter concluded with a question that pierced Karl like a bayonet. The radio tells us America is suffering, that their cities will soon burn as ours do, that victory remains certain. Yet these same broadcasts once promised Russia would fall in weeks, and England soon after. What is the truth, brother? Is there abundance there as the rumors suggest, or is it propaganda meant to weaken our resolve? Sometimes I look at Mother thinning by the day and wonder what we're sacrificing for. Write when you can. We treasure every word. She'd signed it as always, your loving sister. The familiar loops of her signature unchanged since childhood, when they'd practiced penmanship together at their kitchen table in a world not yet shattered by bombs. Karl folded the letter carefully, aligning its creases with mechanical precision. In the distance, the camp kitchen was already preparing for tomorrow's meals. They would eat bacon and eggs for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, some kind of roast for dinner. His stomach, trained by months of this routine, gurgled in anticipation, even as his mind recoiled at the contrast. He couldn't bring himself to write the truth to Greta, that he ate meat almost daily, that butter was served without ceremony, that the America they'd been taught to despise as weak and decadent was strong precisely because of its abundance. Such truths would serve no purpose except to deepen her despair. Instead, he would write platitudes, assurances of his health, perhaps some sanitized descriptions of Texas landscapes. He would pretend, as they all did in their letters home, that some fundamental balance remained in the world, but as Karl tucked Greta's letter alongside the others beneath his mattress, the weight of what remained unwritten pressed down on him like earth on a coffin. The truth was there in every bite he took, in every ounce gained while Berlin starved. Germany was already defeated, not by bullets but by bread, not on battlefields but in kitchens. And he, Karl Brenner, prisoner of war, was growing fat on the evidence. Sunday arrived again, with its now familiar rituals. Karl stood in the shower, hot water, another luxury, scrubbing Texas dust from his skin. His body felt foreign to him now, filling out where it had once been lean from rationing and marching. His uniform had grown tight across the shoulders, snug at the waist. The face in the small mirror above the basin belonged to someone else, a well-fed stranger with clear eyes and healthy color in his cheeks. Karl hardly recognized himself anymore. Certainly his family would find him changed if they ever saw him again. In the mess hall, the aroma of roasting meat dominated once more. Karl took his place in line, tray extended automatically, watching as the American cook, a heavy-set man with perpetually damp temples, portioned out slices of beef alongside potatoes drenched in gravy. "Extra for you, Fritz," the cook said in his drawling accent, dropping an additional piece onto Karl's plate. This had become something of a ritual between them, though Karl had never understood why he'd been singled out for this small kindness. Perhaps he reminded the cook of someone. Perhaps it meant nothing at all. Karl nodded his thanks, the same measured movement each time, neither too grateful nor too proud. He carried his tray to the usual table where Werner was already seated, napkins spread across his lap with mathematical precision. The professor had developed a theory about their treatment, which he expounded upon regularly to anyone who would listen. "It's a form of psychological warfare," he insisted, voice low, as Karl took his seat. "Show the captured enemy your prosperity. Let him experience it firsthand. Let him internalize it. When he returns home, he carries that experience with him. He becomes the virus that infects his society with doubt about its own systems." Werner tapped his fork against his plate for emphasis. Brilliant strategy, really. Much more effective than starvation or brutality, which only hardens resistance. Karl had tired of these analyses, these endless dissections of their situation. Werner approached captivity like an academic problem, something to be solved through intellect rather than endured through will. "Or maybe they feed us like this because they can," Karl replied flatly. "Because abundance requires no strategy." He cut into his meat, watching pink juice pool beneath it. "Not everything is calculation, Professor." But even as he said it, Karl recognized the falsehood. Everything in war was calculation. Resources, manpower, industrial capacity, agricultural yield. The Reich's calculations had simply proved wrong, their equations built on fantasy rather than fact. Across the mess hall, a commotion broke out near the entrance. New prisoners arriving, a rare occurrence these days as the European front shifted eastward. The newcomers stood blinking in the doorway, hollow-cheeked and wary, their uniforms hanging from diminished frames. Karl recognized the look immediately. These men had been fighting recently, had come directly from the collapsing German lines in France or Italy. They carried the actual war on them still, in their gaunt faces and suspicious eyes, in the way they flinched at sudden movements from the American guards. The mess hall fell silent as the established prisoners regarded these apparitions from the world they'd left behind. One of the new arrivals, an officer by his insignia, though his uniform was so filthy and torn it was difficult to be certain, surveyed the room with undisguised shock. His gaze moved from the full plates to the prisoners' healthy faces, lingering on the American guards casually leaning against walls, weapons holstered rather than at the ready. Something in the officer's expression collapsed, some final resistance giving way to comprehension. It was a look Karl had seen before on the faces of civilians in occupied villages when they first realized the extent of Germany's lies. a look of betrayal more profound than mere defeat. The betrayal of discovering that one's suffering had been unnecessary, built on foundations of falsehood. The American cook approached the new prisoners, gesturing them toward the serving line with the same casual friendliness he showed everyone. "Come on, boys. Food's getting cold." His words were incomprehensible to them, but his meaning clear enough. Still, they hesitated, exchanging glances, until the officer gave a slight nod. They moved forward with military discipline, accepting trays, receiving portions that made their eyes widen, despite attempts at stoicism. Carl watched them struggle to maintain dignity in the face of such unexpected treatment, recognized their confusion because it had once been his own. How did one reconcile enemy and benefactor in the same figures? How did one accept kindness from those one had been trained to hate? As the new prisoners found seats, awkwardly navigating the social geography of a camp they didn't yet understand, Carl felt something shift within himself, some tectonic movement of perspective that had been building since his first meal in captivity. The truth he'd been avoiding for months crystallized with sudden, painful clarity. Germany would lose this war. Not because its soldiers lacked courage or its people conviction, but because courage and conviction couldn't compensate for empty granaries and depleted factories. His country would lose because its leaders had failed to understand the mathematics of modern warfare, that industrial capacity trumped ideology, that wheat fields were as strategically vital as tank divisions. Germany would lose because, while its people subsisted on bread crusts and propaganda, its enemies grew strong on stakes and reality. Carl set down his fork, appetite suddenly gone despite the perfect meal before him. In that moment, he made the decision that would define his post-war life, though he didn't yet recognize its significance. He would write to Greta tonight and tell her the truth, not to wound her with what she couldn't have, but to prepare her for the world that would emerge from this conflict. He would describe the abundance he'd witnessed, the industrial might it represented. He would tell her that the future belonged not to those who claimed racial superiority or historical destiny, but to societies that could feed their people while feeding their prisoners steak on Sundays. He would warn her that Germany's defeat was inevitable, not to break her spirit, but to help her survive what came after. It would be his first honest letter since capture, perhaps his first honest words since donning the uniform. The truth felt dangerous, revolutionary, necessary. It tasted of surrender, but also of something else, something that might, in time, resemble hope. Carl kept every letter from those Texas days, yellowed pages bearing witness to a pivot point in history. After returning to Berlin in 1946, he found Greta and his mother living in a basement apartment, their building half collapsed from Allied bombing. They embraced him as a ghost returned, marveling at his healthy appearance amid their own gauntness. The family butcher shop reopened in 1948, though rationing continued for years. Carl applied techniques he'd observed in the camp kitchens, American efficiency married to German precision. When customers asked how a POW had learned such methods, he answered truthfully, "From the enemy who fed me better than my own country." Greta married an American occupation officer in 1950, causing neighborhood whispers that faded as more German women made similar choices. Carl stood witness at their wedding, watching his sister step willingly into the future he'd described in those contraband truthful letters from Texas. By 1955, Carl's butcher shop had expanded to 3 locations across West Berlin. During the Berlin airlift, he volunteered as a translator, explaining to former enemies how to distribute food efficiently to a starving city. Some recognized him from the Texas camp, nods of recognition across ideological divides, now rendered meaningless by hunger's simple arithmetic. When the wall rose in 1961, Carl lost contact with cousins trapped on the eastern side. Packages he sent returned unopened. Letters disappeared into bureaucratic voids. The divisions hardened like scar tissue across the city's wounded geography. In 1970, Carl traveled to Texas with his own son, retracing the journey that had transformed him. The camp was gone, replaced by a shopping center where Americans purchased abundance without thought. Standing in the parking lot, Carl described to his puzzled son how enemy kindness had accomplished what propaganda never could, revealing truth through a simple Sunday meal. During the 1980s oil crisis, when temporary shortages caused American panic, Carl wrote an editorial for the Berlin newspaper. A nation that has never known true hunger cannot understand the difference between inconvenience and starvation. The perspective of one who had seen both worlds resonated across decades. When the wall fell in 1989, Carl stood among cheering crowds, watching East Berliners' faces as they encountered Western supermarkets for the first time. Their expressions mirrored what he had felt 45 years earlier in that Texas mess hall, the collapse of certainty, the vertigo of abundance after scarcity. In his final years, Carl frequently hosted veterans from both sides of the conflict. Over shared meals at his dining table, former enemies discovered common ground in memories of deprivation and gratitude for survival. The steaks he served each Sunday became a ritual of remembrance and reconciliation. Karl Brenner died in 2003, leaving behind memoirs titled Bread and Dignity. His funeral was attended by 3 former Texas camp guards, elderly men who traveled across an ocean to honor the prisoner who had become a friend. His gravestone bears a simple epitaph. He understood the true cost of war was measured not in territory gained, but in hunger endured.